Thank you very much. So my name is Damsgaard Jensen. I am head of the cybersecurity section at the Technical University of Denmark. And I'm going to be talking about IoT security, but not in the sense that you've heard about IoT security for the past couple of years, in the sense that IoT security is horrible and that it's a very big problem with the IoT equipment, that it's insecure. I will touch upon that, but the main bulk of my presentation is going to talk about how we can use IoT equipment to actually build more secure systems in general. So, we have these visions of IoT. We have this beautiful house that somebody's built somewhere, and we put in a whole lot of equipment. There is the classical home automation equipment with timers built in. We have kind of like things that can look, sensors that will say, is there sunshine outside? Should we roll down the blinds, or should we do something with the lighting inside the building? We can have security cameras being set up in the environment to supervise what is going on. Yeah, I have to move around a little bit because I have to forward the slides here manually. Of course, we have these temperature sensors and similar stuff. Oh, there's the clicker. Yes, it works. Excellent. This one, next slide. Okay, brilliant. And of course, we've all heard about these intelligent refrigerators that we will get that will make sure that we get new milk whenever the old milk is off, and all these other things. The heating that corresponds, so basically an actuator that works with the temperature sensor that we have, fans or air conditioning equipment, lighting. We've all seen Philips Hue light bulbs and other smart automated lighting systems. So all of these things are compound of the smart environment, and we can also imagine that we control our music, so we get the mood in the room to fit the other ambience, the lighting, and all of this connected together. The home entertainment system, the smart TVs, and similar stuff. So we have all these visions of IT, and of course there's a big problem with that, because when we start looking at it, so in the top left corner you see a popular home security IP enabled home security camera from Xiaoming, Chinese manufacturer, where the bulk of the development has been spent on making this cheap. Okay, and that's the main argument for selling this equipment, is that it's cheap. This is the kind of camera that was used by the Mirai botnet to compromise a large section, created the DNS vulnerability, or the vulnerability, and also the attack that basically put most of the east coast of the US out of commission. Major services, Twitter, Amazon, YouTube, were unavailable because of a fault in a poorly designed home appliance. This is a door lock, Bluetooth door lock that we see more and more. I should actually not have advanced it so quickly. The idea is that these things, some of them, the cheaper models, don't have a physical part or connection between the outside of the lock and the inside of the lock. That's the old part of the lock. So this can be after-fitted on any lock that you have at home. But if you do not have a physical contact between these two, but it's only an electronic part that's controlled by the intelligence, then the fail-safe must be to unlock the door. Okay, because in case of a fire and the equipment malfunctions, then people should be able to go out. Okay. In the cheaper of these versions, so not the one shown on the picture, but in the cheaper of these versions, this can then be exploited by simply overloading it, by sending it Bluetooth requests. And then when the lock has received too many requests, it gets into the fault states. The fail-safe mode is to unlock. And so simply by sending a lot of messages to the lock, you can unlock the door. Okay. That's not what the door lock owners intended. Oops. Double speed here. The lower left corner is waste management, water management facility. It's not the one in Maroochydore in Australia, but back in 2001 there was a disgruntled employee from the community, the municipality, who decided that he wasn't paid enough and was very unhappy that he was not being given to continue his work as a private contractor at a higher salary. And so he basically bought equipment, radio equipment of the same type that the Maroochydore themselves were using, and then he could go in and hack all of these, starting up pumps, closing down valves, changing the flow of wastewater in Maroochydore, and meant that millions of liters of wastewater was directed into the parks of the city, and also just untreated into the river going through the city. And so that was because there was no sufficient security levels in there. So it's very much security by obscurity. And as he knew about it, he basically could control the wastewater system in the city. And of course, the last is an example of a temperature gauge that can interact with the rest of your home. It looks very beautiful, but unfortunately that has also been hacked. And that the reason why I've included it here is that Nest, who developed this, has been bought by Google, and so even the big companies can fail. So it's not just I buy from a big recognized provider as opposed to the cheap Chinese provider. Even the high-end equipment can be hacked. And so you can say, well, hasn't Google done anything about this? Of course they have. They have released patches to make sure that your system works. Okay, and so that's very responsible for Google. But start imagining that in your home you need to update, make sure that you have the patches for your refrigerator, your washer, your clothes dryer, your coffee machine maker, and all the other kinds of equipment that we envisage being smart within the near future. Okay, I mean, patch Tuesday and your house will not work, right? So really there is a big problem here, and especially if you have to go out and find these things for your own. So definitely there is problems with the IoT security. However, that is not where I'm going to be investing my time here. What I'm going to be saying is a little bit more of the sales pitch for IoT equipment, that if we have secure IoT equipment, there's a whole lot of new stuff that we can do, which is basically making the security that we claim that we already have. Okay, and part of this is, of course, by getting context. So when I go out shopping, I have this small trick, and maybe most of you have, that we go out to the parking lot just next to the shop, and if we forgot where we exactly put our car, we'll just go in the general direction where we believe it was, and then we'll click on the car key, and then eventually something will lighten up, and that's our car, right? Many people do that. It works in a small parking lot. It doesn't work everywhere, okay? So that's the idea here, that context is a quite important thing. If we are looking at a crash site, okay, this is a car ramming a school bus. There's a whole lot of people there. If you look at a lot of the guys with the vests on them, they are healthcare professionals. If I'm on the stretcher, I want them to know everything about me that they need to know to save my life. Okay, so but if you look at the front, there are two guys down there, one with a tripod, one with a camera around their neck. Doesn't look like healthcare professional, looks more like journalists to me. They should not have access to my healthcare information. So I have this kind of like, even the classical break glass kind of policy where you can be allowed access if there is a major event going on that basically to save the patient's life. Okay, we need to constrain what it is that we are doing to make sure that only the people who should really see this information and should hear about this information gets that information available. So we cannot just spread it to everybody in the vicinity. So that's another example of why context is important. And of course, how do we make sure that the people in here that we have given access to data are the only one who will see this data? I conjecture that this is impossible. Okay, and that is basically part of what it is that I'm going to be talking to you about. Okay, you know the phenomena as shoulder surfing, and that's kind of like a problem. Going back to my own, going back 10, 15 years, back when banks had branches and were not just online for most of the interactions. You regularly visited your branch and you talked to your bank advisor in your branch. He was pulling up information on his monitor and looking at it and giving you advice. Okay. And they were in an open plan office with all their other bank advisors sitting just next to them and with their customers sitting just next to them as well. So whoever was sitting at the bank advisor behind my bank advisor would be able to look into the screen with my personal banking information. Okay. And that's kind of like a problem that we should really have thought about when we designed these kind of environments, but that we haven't looked at. Okay. So when we talk about security, and in particular we talk about access control models, we talk about security being enforced by two means. The logical security, which is basically everything that the computer can enforce all by itself, and the physical security, which is everything where the computer needs external help. So you hear security professionals saying, well, unless you lock your servers in a locked facility, you don't have security. If people have physical access to your computer, it's not secure. Okay? So that's kind of like the kind of division between physical and logical security. And when we look at the security mechanisms that we install, then for data, we have very, very fine-grained security mechanisms. Okay? We have record-level locking of database records. We have file-level access to files in the file system and so on and so forth. But when we look at the physical security, we don't have the same compartmentalization. Basically, physical access control is, do you have access either to the room, but in more cases, just access to the building. And then that's where the limits are. Okay? So when we look at this distinction between physical and logical security, when we talk about, as computer security professionals, and especially as academics, we talk very much about the model showing, and this is being provable secure inside our model. Okay? But we're talking exclusively about the logical security. And in a computer system, the humans are not part of the computer systems. We are not cyborgs. We are humans, we're outside the system, we need some kind of a representation inside the system in order for the system to reason about us. Similarly with the data is not directly consumable from the computer disk. We need to have it rendered in some form so that we can consume it either on a monitor, on a printer, or somewhere else. Okay? So we have this, that we are in physical form and need to have a logical representation for the logical access control mechanism to work with us. And similarly, that the logical data needs to have a physical rendition or rendering in order for us to be able to interact with it and understand it and process it. So when we look at the access control, we look at the requirements of confidentiality. That is really constraining the access to the output devices. That could be monitors, that could be printers. And with respect to integrity, we can control this by controlling the access to the input devices, keyboards, whatever it is that we use to provide input to our system. So in practice, what we have is we have a guy sits down in front of the monitor or the computer for whatever shape. That could have been a smartphone, could have been a tablet, could have been anything. Right? Could have been his Nest temperature gauge in his home. But he sits down, he needs to type something in so that the computer knows who he is. A login and a password is the most used way of doing this. And what it does is that it gives him starts up a process which has a UID associated, a user ID associated with this guy. Okay? And then there is the reference monitor in the file system that whenever he accesses something, So whenever he wants to access a file on the disk, then the reference monitor will check the UID, check the security policy and say yes or no to this access. That's basically how an access control mechanism works. Okay? So going back to my distinction between logical and physical security and realizing that whatever the computer can do is only in the logical sphere, then what we have is protected by the mechanisms is the green area. Okay? Everything else is basically the trust of the user. That he hasn't he's really making sure that if he has highly confidential information on his monitor, he's not allowing people to stand around him looking at it. Okay? Similarly, or kind of like to reinforce the same point, when we look at the granularity, and I've said this, I realized before, that we have the physical access control is a room, a floor, a building, and that basically constrains the logical access control. Okay, so from a logical point of view, when we say only that person has access to read this data, it means this person has logged in, authenticated himself to the system, has been authorized to put that data, render this data physically on his device. And then him and everybody else in the room, because that's the only thing we can say from the logical point of view, is allowed to see this data. Okay? So really the granularity of the physical access control is what decides, constrains the logical access control. So when we're thinking about the minimum access, the least privilege given out by the physical and the access control policy, then more oftenly it's the physical access control that decides who can watch the data. So that led us to develop a model that we call sensor-enhanced access control, where we basically want to make sure that the access control policies that we define, and that's every professional, security professional, will be talking about their logical access control. They'll be talking about who has access to data, and they will say that person has access to data, not that person and everybody in the room with him has access to that data. Okay? Because that's not how we think about it. But that's what we wanted to do with this sensor-enhanced access control. So basically making sure that our intentions, as they are encoded in our logical access control policies, are actually being enforced out in the physical environment. So what we've done is that we've defined two models. One is a logical access control model, which in principle could be any access control mechanism. So any file system that we could use in our model. But of course, access control is typically divided into mandatory and discretionary access control. And in discretionary access control, it's left as to a discretion of the user who he wants to forward or who else he wants to give access to this data, which means that basically we rely on the same trust in that user as we do in kind of like the standard way of thinking about access control. Which means that if you want to really enforce this, it's more when we have mandatory access control models, which would be in, of course, in defense, but also in healthcare. You have lawyers who want to make sure that only the right people can access this data, and so on and so forth. So there are sectors where this is quite important, where you would want to restrict access to only the people that have actually been named in your security policy. And then finally, we have the environmental access control, and that's kind of like the second model, and that's the one that is the more interesting one from enforcing this logical access control in the physical world. So what we do with the environmental access control model is to try to establish the context of the subjects and the objects that we have. Subjects are the active entities in the system. So the user who sits down in front of the computer monitor will be a subject, but he will not be rendered into the system. But the process that he starts when he logs in will then become a subject in the logical access control model. But we want to also have the context of that physical person known to the system. Okay? Then we define what we call authorization zones. So those are the zones where when we authorize data to be shown, to render to the user, then everybody within that zone will be able to see that data. So basically everybody inside the authorization zone should be considered as part of the access control request. So that would be where we can see a monitor from, or printers, who has access to the room where the printer is at the moment when it starts printing. And then we want to enforce the logical access control for the object in the entire authorization zone. And in order to do this, we need to have continuous enforcement. Okay? Again, when we go back to the logical access control, where we do not worry about the environment, that process has the right UID to be able to read this data. Okay? That doesn't change, okay, or rarely changes, and it's one of the standard assumption is that it doesn't change. But when we start thinking about the physical environment, somebody else could get into the room, and we know that, so we cannot ignore that. And therefore, we need to have continuous enforcement of our access control. So, kind of like a motivation, we have this open plan office. We have the people sitting there, and you can see kind of like in yellow, where you can see this output from this monitor. We have these guys in green. They're all authorized to see the data, so that's fine, that's not a problem. Data is on the screen. This guy gets up, he's outside the authorization zone, but as he gets into it, it doesn't really change anything, right? He's still allowed to see the data, shouldn't do anything. When this guy, who is not allowed to see it, gets in there, something must happen. Okay? And what that something is can be variable. We can have different somethings that we want to make happen. In the first instance, we actually relied just on the X window system and the ability to unmap a window. So when the red guy went into the authorization zone, the visibility zone for that window, then it would just unmap on the screen. It would no longer be available to anybody. Okay, well, you could remap it when he left again, but basically it will not be visible to anybody. Which is, imagine that you're sitting in that office and your window suddenly disappears and then reappears as this guy continues walking, not just here, but passes on, right? I mean, that would be hell working in such an environment. So we've looked at this, and we have other ways of dealing with this that will hopefully be published soon. But the unmapping has been published a few years ago. So this is kind of like the thing that we want to be able to do. Okay, and this is, it looks kind of like, yeah, but that is only relevant for open plan offices, but actually not. I mean, similarly, there's a market for privacy screens for laptops, because people bring their laptops out into the environment where they can work. Okay, and so you have this privacy screen that makes the laptop visible only from right in front of the laptop. And that is quite useful if you are sitting in a place where it's not obvious for people to be right behind you. Okay? Where do people work? Business people, busy business people. A lot of the time, I see these people, they prepare themselves in the flights. Okay? So they at least the seat row behind them, and probably the row further behind, will be fairly easily be able to watch what's on their monitor. And they're standing right behind the person. So the privacy filter doesn't do anything there. Okay? So something more clever needs to be done, and that's what we've been looking at with this work. Okay. So how much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. So I'll even leave a little bit of time for questions, I think. So this is basically the architecture that we developed. We have a standard operating system down here. We have the files, we have the file system access control mechanism. We have the process that opens and reads and writes these files. That's fully standard still. But then we have a visibility manager. So the only thing this process needs to do in top of what it does today is it just needs to say, I have now opened this file. And then we have associated with that file, we have the access control policy for that file. Then the visibility manager will know what window that the process has opened and where the file is being displayed. And then it will communicate with a context manager that will have sensors out in the environment. That could be cameras, that could be infrared sensors that detect motion moving around. But we need to be able to authenticate people, and we've done work on what we call persistent authentication to track people in an environment and keep their authentication so we know exactly who is in the authorization zone for this equipment. And so the context manager will tell how people are moving around. The visibility manager will say where are the authorization zones for these areas and who should be allowed to watch this window. So when a person walks into the visibility or the authorization zone, then it can modify the visibility of this window in order to enforce the logical access control policy. So to sum up, security decisions depend on the context in which they're made. And what we want to build into our access control mechanism is some kind of context attributes. We need to know what is the authorization zone for a particular output device. And we need to know something about the users, which could change also because I may not want people to have access to my medical data on a regular basis. So all the ambulance drivers and the paramedics should not have access to my health data on a regular basis. But if they are responding to an accident where I'm involved, yes, by all means, save my life, right? These kind of dynamic environments relating to the users are quite important. Object attributes relating to what kind of data is it that we've stored. One thing is when we're looking at data where, and especially with the GDPR, we collect data for one purpose and then we can only use it for that purpose. So if we want to access for another purpose, then basically that's illegal according to the GDPR. Traditional access control mechanism doesn't capture that very well. We can put in constraints, but it starts getting difficult. If we can annotate the objects with this kind of information, maybe we can do something there. So that's also work that we are looking at the moment. And then, of course, the whole environment, what is happening, who's moving around, what's the general state, okay? If I have surveillance cameras in my house, I may not want people outside to have access to that. Or if I have it maybe in a larger facility like our university, maybe I do not want everybody outside that university to have access to that. But if there is a fire and I'm in a room, I'd like the fire brigade to know I'm in that room so they can send in somebody to drag me out, right? So again, context is quite important here. And we need to have access control mechanisms like sensor-enhanced access control to enforce these kind of policies. So that was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe someone have questions? Yes, please.
When looking at the open office idea that you showed us, how would you identify the people at first? Like you said something about continual authentication, but what is the first step? How do they authenticate?
So most businesses, you have a swipe card, you have some kind of authentication when you show in the morning. And that's basically what I will piggyback on. So when you authenticate first in the morning in the door control system, then from there on, you will be monitored by the persistent authentication mechanism. So whenever you are walking around in the building, it will know who is approaching a door, who's entering a room, who's walking in front of a monitor. And it has actually the added advantage that you can have a room building, especially if you have electronic lock system on all the doors, that you can have a building that is where all the doors are permanently locked. And everybody who's allowed to only walks into rooms where they are allowed to walk in will never notice that any doors are locked, because you can unlock them as they are approaching the door automatically, because you know who they are. And then you're saying crying privacy, that's a major problem, right? But you don't need to store any of this information because all these decisions are instantaneous. So you only need to know whoever is there now, who is he, right? But you don't need to know where people were like 10 seconds ago. So when you leave the facility in the evening, you're forgotten. Nobody will know what you've done. Of course, it depends on whoever is able to collect that data actually only collects the data that they are allowed to collect. That's for sure.